Hi guys, I hope you enjoyed Barbie Nation. Maybe enjoy is a weird word, very strange, but since our week this week is about women in the body, it's an appropriate start. I also hope that you went through and answered those questions about Barbie Nation as a way of kind of thinking through that film and that idea, those ideas about women's bodies. So last week we talked about where women's writing comes from. You know, most of the women, for example, Virginia Woolf talks about this in A Rumor for One's Own. Bell Hooks talks about this in Talking Back. Where does women's writing come from? So if you're a man, you have this very long history. If it's British literature, it's 1100 years of everything from Beowulf to something contemporary like The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. But you have this entire history of people to look to. Bell Hooks talks about looking to the women in her family, this talking, this gossip, this exchange of ideas, this sassiness that they engage in as a way of thinking about how women speak to each other, how they speak to the world, how they speak to children, how they speak to men. What is woman's language? Then we had Alice Walker, who talks about In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And she is interested in Zora Neale Hurston. She's interested in the way Zora Neale Hurston talks. She's also interested in the art created by women, and in particular, her mother. She talks about the beauty of her garden, right? An artistic outlet. We talked a little bit last time about Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir, who tries to figure out why cross-culturally have women been devalued. And Simone de Beauvoir comes up with this idea that it has to do with women and the body. Woman's animality is more manifest than man. Man typically is the creature who goes out into the world, who engages in war, who engages in adventure, who creates culture, who creates art, who builds bridges and roads and these kind of cultural artifacts that we can see. Woman, on the other hand, engages in the creation of, babies, which ties her to nature in a very obvious and specific way, in a way that man is not tied to nature. So the same thing with this idea of bleeding. For women, bleeding is this natural occurrence. For men, bleeding is ritualized, whether it takes place in bloodletting, like a blood ritual, or whether it takes place in war. So men are seen as aligned with culture, and women are seen as aligned with nature. So if we think about culture as the thing that we create in order to tame or mimic or improve on nature, then we see culture as something better than nature. And if we align men with culture and we align women with nature, we begin to see men as somehow superior to women, particularly in terms of their creativity. So who are the women writers, who are the women artists to look to when there is not, or there was not for a long time, this long line of women artists? And when women did create art, it didn't look like men's art because they weren't concerned with the same things that men were concerned with. Excuse me. So I want to begin tonight with one of your reading assignments, which is Sharon Olds' The Language of the Brag. If you remember last week, we looked at Sharon Olds' poem That Year about the girl who talks about learning about Auschwitz in history class and social studies, thinking about the fact that she is a Jew, thinking about the girl who is killed in her class, thinking about escaping her abusive father because her mother has hidden the children and taken them away, and the way these activities all connect. We have history itself, the history of the Holocaust. We have local history, the history of the girl. We have personal history, the history of this family, that this dysfunctional family that disintegrates. But at the end of all of this is, for Oles, this idea of surviving. So that's the kind of poems that she writes. So I want to look at one of her other poems as a way of thinking about this idea of woman in the body and how women write about, what is it that women write about? How do they write about the body? And how is their writing about the body, writing about the world, different than the man? So I want us to look at the poem, The Language of the Brag, because this is all about language, right? Okay, let's take a look at it. Open your books. And this is on page 559. So go ahead and find it. Go ahead and find The Language of the Brag. And so as we read through this poem, I want you to think about certain things. First of all, I want you to think about language. And you might just take a pencil and kind of circle what you would identify as kind of masculine language. Remember, we talked a little bit last time about the masculine and the feminine. What words do we align with the masculine? What words do we align with the feminine? And how are those different? And how is Oles saying that the words we typically align with the feminine are not, in fact, remember how we talked about weak words or negative words? She's going to flip it on its head and make them positive words. All right, the language of the brag. All right, so when we think about bragging, a couple of questions to get us started. When we think about bragging, who do we think about bragging? Do women usually engage in this kind of language? Now, Bell Hooks aligned woman's language with gossip. You know, she talked about her aunts, her mother, female cousins sitting around the kitchen or sitting around the living room or sitting around talking about what's happening in the community. So we usually align women's language with gossip and men's language with bragging. But Oles is going to appropriate the language of the brag in order to talk about or look at a way that a woman can write and engage in these epic activities. So let's take a look at the language of the brag. I have wanted excellence in the knife throw. I have wanted to use my exceptionally strong and accurate arms and my straight posture and quick electric muscles to achieve something at the center of a crowd. The blade piercing the deep bark, the haft slowly and heavily vibrating like the cock. I have wanted some epic use for my excellent body, some heroism, some American achievement beyond the ordinary for my extraordinary self. Magnetic and tensile, I have stood by the sandlot and watched the boys play. I have wanted courage. I have thought about fire and the crossing of waterfalls. I have dragged around my belly, big with cowardice and safety, my stool black with iron pills, my huge breasts oozing mucus, my legs swelling, my hands swelling, my face swelling and darkening, my hair falling out, my inner sex stabbed again and again with terrible pain like a knife. I have lain down. I have lain down and sweated and shaken and passed blood and feces and water, and slowly alone in the center of a circle I have passed the new person out, and they had lifted the new person free of the act and whacked the new person free of that language of blood like praise all over the body. I have done what you wanted to do, Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg. I have done this thing. I and the other women, this exceptional act with the exceptional heroic body, this giving birth, this glistening verb, and I am putting my proud American boast right here with the others. All right, so let's think about what Oles is doing. If we look at the masculine language, What are some of the words that you pick out that indicate a kind of masculine language? So if we go back to the poem, we see knife throw. There are not a lot of women knife throwers out there, right? Exceptionally strong and accurate arms. Remember, men are usually aligned with upper body strength. Women are usually aligned with lower body strength. So this idea of the upper body, the strong upper body. The blade piercing the deep bark. Of course, all of that, the knife throw, the blade, goes back to something else we talked about last week, the phallocentric culture. The phallus, right, which is king. Everywhere you see, that's what's important. Okay. Then boys' games. Boys' games have been traditionally more important than girls' games. You know, she says, I have wanted some epic use for my excellent body. So, excellent use for my excellent body. She's playing on this idea that men go on these adventures and become the center of epics. And now that we don't have sort of epic adventures anymore, what we have is sports, right? We all gather around and watch the boys play in these big, what do they call them? Arenas, right? So it replaces this idea of the epic, the idea of the gladiators. We put them in these big arenas, and hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people tune in to watch the boys play. Beyond the ordinary for my extraordinary self, we still think of our greatest athletes, all of our greatest athletes are men, right? Every now and then we'll mention a woman, but if you say, oh, who is the great athlete? I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky, and Muhammad Ali just died, right? And every dignitary you can think of from, Bill Clinton, Jesse Jackson, Will Smith. Will Smith was one of the pallbearers. They were all here. All the news agencies were here for this great athlete. Now, he hasn't been an athlete for, 40 years. Doesn't matter. The greatest, GOAT, greatest of all time, right? All right. I have stood by the sandlot and watched the boys play. Girls is this idea of excluded. The girls are excluded from that circle of excellence. I have stood by the sandlot and watched the boys play. We even have insults for girls. For boys, you throw like a girl, right? As if that's a bad thing. So she says, I have wanted courage, because we usually also align heroism with men. And I have thought about fire and the crossing of waterfalls, again, going to that idea of adventure. And I have dragged around, then there's a turn in the poem, my belly. Belly? What's that? Why belly, right? Big with cowardice and safety. All right, so we align women with this idea of they're not heroes, they're cowards. You know, women are the ones that you keep safe, but she's about to flip it. She's going into that language in order to flip it. And then she starts naming all of these things that sort of happen to your body when you're pregnant. And they're all pretty horrible, right? My stool black with iron pills, my huge breast oozing mucus, my legs swelling, my hands swelling. Anybody who's ever been pregnant will tell you it ain't no walk in the park. You know, it is not for cowards. It is not for cowards, because it is very tough. And then you have the baby. This idea. So she goes back to this idea of this metaphor of the knife throw. She says, my hair falling out, my inner sex stabbed again and again with terrible pain like a knife. I have lain down. Okay, but to lie down is not to give up in this case, because it's a different kind of language for women than men. So to lie down for a woman, right, is to produce a new life, and sweated and shaken and pass blood and feces and water and slowly alone. So I don't have a big arena where I have 100,000 or 200,000 people or millions of people watching me on television to come see me. I have had to do it alone without the cheering crowds, right? I have passed the new person out. Now, it's kind of a joke. So you can throw a football or a basketball and have hundreds of thousands or millions of people watch you. but I can pass a new human being out of my body. Woo! Drop the mic, walk away, right? This is what she's saying. And they have lifted the new person free of the act. So she's saying that giving birth is an act akin to any epic adventure that any man could go on. You can chase waterfalls, you can go through fire, you can throw knives, but nothing compares to pushing a human being out of you. Wow, top that. You can't. Drop the mic. Walk away. No way you can top it, right? And then she's going to get to this idea of language. Because here's the other thing. She says, I have done what you wanted to do, Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg. Now, Walt Whitman was a 19th century American writer. He is considered the kind of father of modern or contemporary American poetry. His great book, Leaves of Grass, ushered in the kind of foundation for all American poetry. And one of the things that Whitman writes about, or one of the things that makes his poetry so different from all the people who came ahead of him, was that he wrote about the ordinary people. He wanted to be a poet of the people. First of all, he calls himself Walt, which is a nickname, not Walter. Doesn't have three names, doesn't have a middle initial, just Walt. He also wore these khaki pants and this white shirt that was open at the collar and a hat kind of tilted on his head. In his first edition of Leaves of Grass, he doesn't even put his name. He's just got a picture of himself kind of standing there looking cool, looking like a guy just getting off work. And he mentions his name in the poem. But so he wanted to be a poet of the people. He wanted everybody in America to have a copy of Leaves of Grass in their back pocket. All right, so Walt Whitman is very important. But one of the things he wrote about was the ordinary people. He wrote about the barmaid, the maid, the slave on the auction block, ordinary people, firemen, farmers. He wrote about childbirth. But he could write about it, but he could never do it. And then Allen Ginsberg, who is about 100 years after Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg was a beat poet, part of the 1950s beat poetry movement into the 60s. And he wrote kind of a answer to or a continuation of Leaves of Grass called Howl. That was really about where Walt Whitman's very optimistic about the country and just kind of celebrating it. Allen Ginsberg is calling it to task or taking it to task. And so he also writes in a very plain style, often very raw. And he writes too about childbirth. But again, he can write about it, but he can't do it. And so she says, I have done what you wanted to do, Walt Whitman, Allen Ginsberg. Okay, so you write about childbirth, but you can't do it, but I've done it. And what else has she done? I have done this thing. I and the other women, this exceptional act with the exceptional heroic body, this giving birth, this glistening verb, and I am putting my proud American boast right here with the others. So it's not just about giving birth, though. What else is it about? It's about writing. Because listen here, not only can I write about giving birth, I can actually give birth. And I also I've created both a human being or birthed a human being, and I've also created a poem about a human being. So here's my poem, right, to add to your poems, my proud American boast. Plus, I got a baby. Yeah. So it's the idea of the language of the brag, right? So women can both create artistically, as in write, but they can also create, as in carry a human being inside them and push that human being into the world. That's a very big thing. Okay. All right. So I want to go on to go ahead and read The Girl and Sex Without Love. The Girl, again, is a kind of up close and personal story of this girl, a young girl who gets kidnapped kind of by these two older boys and raped, and she survives. Her friend is shot, killed, doesn't survive, and the girl has to tell the story in court, but she doesn't even know the words. Her sister has to literally tell her the words. And so what's really phenomenal about that poem, yeah, it's okay. So what's really phenomenal about this is at the end of that poem, remember what I told you about Sharon Olds? She doesn't believe in victimhood. She believes in being a survivor. At the end of it, it's all about the girl's body. Her body has been taken and used by these strangers. She's been raped. She's been shot. She's been left for dead. She's been stripped of her clothes. But at the end of it, what does she do? She says, she throws her body up in the air and kicks her legs and comes home and does the dishes in her homework. She has to work hard in math. The night over the roof of her bed filled with white planets. Every night she prays for the soul of her best friend, the girl who died, and then thanks God for life. She knows what all of us want never to know. And she does a cartwheel. The splits, she shakes the shredded pom-poms in her fist. So she takes her body back. No matter what they tried to do to her body, it's her body. And she doesn't sort of cower away. She shakes the pom-poms in her fist. Here's a story about a survivor. And then Sex Without Love, another examination of the body. How this idea of how women can use or claim their own bodies. Okay, so I want to move now to Madame Allard's breast. Let's think about what Madame Allard's breast. This is the Dion Brand story. So we have these young girls, and this goes along perfectly with our Barbie Nation video. Why are these girls so fascinated by this grown woman? They imagine an entire life for her. They're mad at her husband because they think he mistreats her and maybe he's done something to her. They want to make her jump to see her breasts go up. Why are these girls so fascinated with Madame Allard's breast? What about this adult life that they can only imagine, that they have not yet entered? The velvet curtains, and Madame Allard doesn't do anything to encourage them. Her clothes keep her fully covered, but they are just absolutely fascinated by her breast. It's the same fascination that we saw in Barbie Nation, where the marketers market the story directly to the young girls, the toy directly to the young girls, because young girls are fascinated by the bodies of adult women. They're fascinated by the bodies that they do not yet have, but will have one day. So Madame Allard represents a world that they want to enter, but they can't enter yet. So the story is supposed to be funny. She is not paying those girls any attention, but it's that moment of fascination, that fascination with that adult world. What is adult sexuality like? What is the adult body like? What is the adult world like? And they want to enter that world. And so Diane tells this very humorous story about these girls who just mistreat Madame Allard, who has become this sort of source of fascination in the same way these girls are fascinated with Barbie. Okay, let's talk about woman's writing and woman's body. This one might have been the one of all the ones that you read that gave you some difficulty, right? Which one gave you some difficulty? And so I want to look at that woman's writing and woman's body from Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness. That's the Showalter. So Showalter is asking the question that we asked last week. From whence does woman write? So she goes so far as to say, the pen is phallic. So where does the woman write from if she's using a pen, right? Where does she write from? So what is she talking about? What is she talking about? And she uses this quotation from Sisu, The Laugh of the Medusa. More body, hence more writing. This idea that writing itself, that language itself is masculine. Language carries culture. The culture is phallocentric. The culture is masculine. Therefore, language is masculine. Okay, what do they mean by that? So here are some examples. Think about all the negative words there are to describe women. Just think about them. I mean, you can make yourself a list and they'll just keep on. Remember, I told you there are two kinds of women in the world, good girls and bad girls, Madonnas and whores. That's it. There's no in between, right? You're one or the other. You're the angel in the house or you're the prostitute walking the street. You're the Madonna, the mother, or the whore. You're the good girl or the bad girl. And on that good girl side is anybody who supports phallocentric culture, anybody who supports patriarchy. Patriarchy is simply the notion that men are superior to women, that men are better. That's patriarchy. So anything that supports that cultural notion is good, and anything that challenges that cultural notion is bad, and all the different notions that go along with it. So Showalter is trying to think about how this idea of writing in the body gets played out. So I want you to go ahead and turn to page 358. And let's look at, I'm going to point out a couple of these paragraphs to you. Let's look at a couple of these paragraphs talking about women's writing and women's body. She writes, while feminist criticism rejects the attribution of literal biological inferiority, okay, so feminism, as we talked about last week, feminism or womanism rejects the idea that women are biologically inferior to men. You know, remember that list we put up? Women aren't as physically strong, etc., etc. Who cares? Women aren't as intelligent. That's not true, by the way. All right. Some theorists seem to have accepted the metaphorical implications of female biological difference in writing. So even though we reject this idea that women are not inferior, there's still an homage that we pay to male writing. If I start asking you to name who are the great writers of your time, and I made you make a list, I bet your list of great male writers would be longer than your list of great female writers. Perhaps even if I just ask you to name all the male writers you know versus all the female writers you know, your list of male writers would be much longer than your list of female writers. So even though you don't say this idea, this ideology, remember we talked about ideology a lot, this idea that the masculine is superior to the feminine, in your actions, in your thought processes, in the ideology that undergirds how you think, that seems to be fairly clear. There's more, we're thinking about male writers. Remember I told you J.K. Rowling, she couldn't put her name on there, those books. She had to put J.K. because little boys are not going to read adventure stories written by a woman. It had to be obscured by something else. Even though they know she's a woman, it's just not quite at the forefront, particularly at first. It's okay now that they're very popular. She says, in The Mad Woman in the Attic, for example, Gilbert and Guba structure their analysis of women's writing around metaphors of literary paternity. They quote, this is Gilbert and Guba. These are two women, by the way, two women theorists. In patriarchal Western culture, they maintain, the text author is a father, a progenitor, a procreator, an aesthetic patriarch whose pen is an instrument of generative power like his penis. End quote. Lacking phallic authority, they go on to suggest, women's writing is profoundly marked by the anxieties of this difference. If the pen is a metaphorical penis, from what organ can females generate text? Okay, so this is the question. If the pen is the phallus, from what organ can women generate text? Now I know some of you are probably rolling your eyes, going, "Okay, Dr. Trumbull, what the heck are you talking about? we write from word processors, or we write with a pen. That's not masculine or feminine. That's just, how people write. But remember, they are talking about ideology. We're talking about who influences us, what is considered a worthy text, what is considered a worthy subject for writing. We write by imitating those who have come before us. And so there are a lot of things that go into this activity of writing. Language can be inherently masculine. That's the other thing. Remember, all those words, the language of the brag. Bragging is a masculine thing, right? So, to this rhetorical question, Gilbert and Gubar offer no reply. But it is a serious question of much feminist theoretical discourse. Those critics who, like myself, would protest the fundamental analogy might reply that women generate text from the brain, or that the word processor, with its compactly coded microchips, its inputs and outputs, is a metaphorical womb. The metaphor of literary paternity, as Auerbach has pointed out in her review of The Mad Woman, ignores an equally timeless and, for me, even more oppressive metaphorical equation between literary creativity and childbirth. This idea of perhaps creating a text is like giving birth. So instead of thinking about it in masculine ways in terms of patriarchal authority or authority of where this text is generated from, or the idea of the phallic pen, let's think about writing text as childbirth, as giving birth. The other thing she talks about is the fact that women basically are written. Women don't write. Women are written. Women are written about. Women are created. So let's think about that for a second. The fact that women are created. Let's look at the bottom of 359. Look at that paragraph at the bottom. Feminist criticism, which itself tries to be biological, to write from the critic's body, has been intimate, confessional, often innovative in style and form. Remember I told you last time, like when we were reading Bell Hooks Talking Back, that one of the things that a lot of women writers, particularly women critics, have done is they have, instead of appropriating the forms of male essay or male criticism, they have done their own thing. I mean, one of the ways that Hooks does this is she literally writes about talking back. So she writes about, her relationship with her great-grandmother. She writes about the women in her life. It's a very different type of essay, particularly serious critical essay, than a man would write. It seems much less formal. It seems much more conversational, right? But it is no less serious in gravitas or import or idea. It's no less smart, in other words. It just takes on a different form. Okay. So she goes on to talk about Duplessis' Washing Blood, the introduction to a special issue of feminist studies on the subject of motherhood, proceeds in short lyrical paragraphs to describe her own experience in adopting a child, to recount her dreams and nightmares, and to meditate upon the healing unification of body and mind based not only on lived experiences of motherhood as a social institution, but also on the biological power speaking through us. Now, all right, so what's the big deal? Who cares? Well, the idea is that this kind of criticism that's not cold, that's not sterile, that does not pretend to distance itself from its subject, also leaves the critic very vulnerable, because the critic is using aspects of her own life, as it were, to talk about something quite serious about the culture. And so it lacks that appearance of objectivity and distance, even though it's using that entree in order to talk about something quite serious. Okay, the final little point I want to make about this little section on from Showalter is up here on page 360. All right, about that third sentence in. And as the editors of the journal Questions Feministes point out, it is dangerous to place the body at the center of a search for female identity. The themes of otherness and of the body merge together because the most visible difference between men and women, and the only one we know for sure to be permanent, is indeed the difference in the body. The difference has been used as a pretext to justify, we talked about that quite a bit last time, full power of one sex over the other. The study of biological imagery in women's writing is useful and important as long as we understand that factors other than anatomy are involved in it, their situation in society. For there can be no expression of the body which is unmediated by linguistic, social, and literary structures. The difference of a woman's literary practice, therefore, must be sought in the body of her writing and not in the writing of her body. Okay, so men and women are different. We talked about that quite a bit last week. Men and women are different. They are physically different. They look different. They're biologically different. However, let's not get it twisted. Even though that biology, as I talked about at the beginning, the idea that women's animality is made more manifest because they're the ones that bring forth light, and men are seen as aligned more closely with culture, that means, well, it means nothing really when it comes to writing. Because as Old says in the language of the brag, I have done this thing. I have done what you wanted to do, Walt Whitman and Allen Ginsberg, right? And I am putting my proud American boast right next to yours. All right, so what do I want you to get from this? I want you to get that what Showalter is trying to do is she's trying to get us to divorce ourselves from these alliances we have to biological differences, and to think about writing as coming not from the phallus, not from the womb, but from the brain. The brain. And so this idea of creativity, it moves this idea of creativity from a notion of the pen as a phallus, or from the notion of giving birth, to the notion of intellectual exercise. And women have brains, obviously. And so when we begin to think about writing as an intellectual exercise, it is not aligned with any particular gender. It is aligned with human activity, as it were. Okay, so we're going to look at one last writing, and it's Audre Lorde, Uses of Erotic, the Erotic is Power, which also goes along with our video of Barbie Nation, because as you have seen, even the idea of Barbie has been eroticized. So we know that Barbie was based on a German sex doll, Lily, and that Mattel had this idea, a woman in particular, had this idea of taking this German sex doll and marketing it to little girls in America. And they didn't change her very much, right? And people thought she was crazy, but they were absolutely right. So I want us to think about that as we go into Audre Lorde's Uses of the Erotic is Power, thinking about women's body. Okay, so this idea, women's bodies have been objectified, just as Barbie has been objectified. You saw the people putting nipples and anatomical parts on Barbie and Ken. But this idea of women's bodies being objectified so that they have become not human beings, but in fact objects. And so a lot of times what that does is it makes us not want to think about the body or women in terms of the body, right? But Lord is going to try to bring us back when she talks about uses of the erotic as power, because much of our power she is going to offer lies in the erotic. Now, Lord makes a very important distinction between the pornographic and the erotic. The pornographic is this idea of woman's body as an object, but the erotic has to do with something else, feeling, true feeling and sensation. Okay, so if you look on page 537, she actually defines it for you. She says the erotic has often been misnamed by men and used against women. All right, because in other words, I can objectify you, I can make you an object of desire, and I can take away your agency. But look at what she says. It has been made into the confused, the trivial, the psychotic, the plasticized sensation, like Barbie. For this reason, we have often turned away from the exploration and consideration of the erotic as a source of power and information, confusing it with its opposite, the pornographic. Okay, so the erotic is not the pornographic. But pornography is a direct denial of the power of the erotic, for it represents the suppression of true feelings. So pornography is about objectification. It's about the act in absence of the feeling. Pornography emphasizes sensation without feeling. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. It is an internal sense of satisfaction to which, once we have experienced it, we know we can aspire. For having experienced the fullness of this depth of feeling and recognizing its power, and honor and self-respect, we can require no less of ourselves. Okay, so what is Lord talking about? She's talking about or encouraging women not to be afraid to tap into their erotic power, right? Don't be afraid to do it for fear of the way women's bodies have been misused or objectified by men. That does not mean that there is not power in the body. If you turn over to page 538, she talks about this move to equate the pornographic with the erotic is really a move to deny or to limit women's access to their own erotic power, right? And if you look down at the bottom of page 538, she talks about the different ways those bottom four paragraphs leading up into the next page. She talks about the various ways that the erotic functions for her as providing power. She says the sharing of joy, whether physical, emotional, psychic, or intellectual, forms a bridge between the sharers, which can then be the basis for understanding much of what is not shared between them and lessens the threat of their difference. Okay, she says it also underlines our capacity for joy, right? Look down at the very bottom. She says, that deep and irreplaceable knowledge of my capacity for joy comes to demand from all of my life that it be lived within the knowledge that such satisfaction is possible and does not have to be called marriage, nor God, nor an afterlife. So that, what is she saying? She's saying that generally there are various cultural constructions that suggest to us in what constraints, in what limits, in what categories we may experience joy. All right, we talked about this a little last week, but we didn't really name it. All right, so If I say to you, remember we talked about women who choose not to have children. If I say to you the joy of a woman's life comes from having children, and you don't have any children, what does that mean? You have no access to joy. If I say to you the joy of a woman's life comes in forming a marriage, and you have no intention or desire or interest in being married, I've limited your capacity for joy. If I say the joy of a woman's life exists within the domestic sphere, and you have no interest in being in the domestic sphere, I've limited your joy. So by making you an object, by limiting your possibilities of the erotic, and we're thinking about the erotic as sensation, as feeling, as joy, as possibility. If I put it in these narrow categories and say you only have access to this feeling, this sensation, this possibility, this joy in these very narrow categories, then it limits your possibilities as a human being. But if I begin to expand those, if I say joy for you may be found in lots of different ways. It may be in a connection to another human being. It may be physical. It may be intellectual. It may be in all of these different ways. In other words, what is it that turns you on? What is it that brings you joy? What is it that makes you ecstatic? This idea of ecstasy. And somebody else, the culture, for example, doesn't get to choose what that is, doesn't get to limit it to these very kind of narrow categories. As she says, what does she say? God, the afterlife, marriage, right? These acceptable categories. She says, maybe it's not that. She says, this is one reason why the erotic is so feared and so often relegated to the bedroom alone, when it is recognized at all. For once we begin to feel deeply all the aspects of our life, we begin to demand from ourselves and from our life pursuits that they feel in accordance with that joy which we know ourselves to be capable of. Our erotic knowledge empowers us, becomes a lens through which we scrutinize all aspects of our existence, forcing us to evaluate those aspects honestly in terms of their relative meaning within our lives. What gives you joy? What turns you on? What makes you happy? And it may have absolutely nothing to do, what fills your body with this capacity for wonderment and ecstasy. And it may have absolutely nothing to do with sex, right? The power of the erotic is larger than that. And this is a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. This idea that we limit women's lives very much in terms of what they can do, in terms of where they may find the capacity for joy. What is your language for joy? Okay, so I have posted some questions for you to ask or to answer or to consider, to work your way through all of the readings, so that I want you to have a clear sense. I will also post, or I will email you, I'm saying post, but I mean we'll email you a study guide for your test next week. And I will probably do a video also for next week. You have your midterm next week. And what I'll do is I'll do a review of the readings video for you on all the readings that the midterm will cover, which are the readings for the first 3 weeks. As always, you can email me. Just email me if you have any questions. And I think these readings are fairly easy to comprehend. The only one you may have a little trouble with is uses of the erotic. The erotic is power. Just remember, she's expanding this whole idea of what the erotic is. Just remember, Showalter is talking about writing against this idea that women are written, women don't write. Of course women can write, because it's not about the phallus, it's not about giving birth, the womb, it's about the brain, right? Women write from the brain. And they have the enormous capacity for the intellect, for looking at the world, for, as Alice Walker said, going in search of our mother's gardens, creating beauty, even though it doesn't seem to be any place, finding a space, like in the toilet, finding a space to write, finding the idea of survivorship as opposed to victimhood, and we don't necessarily need a room of one's own, even though Virginia Woolf says we do, but that's because remember, she's talking about being excluded from the library, from everywhere. Okay, take care.